Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Today we have our Syllabi work group, and this is our equity midwifery quarterly call. Just as a reminder, our quarterly calls are this interactive space, but we're going to go ahead and record the first little chunk where we're going to cover some content, and then we'll be interacting with each other, which we won't record for posterity. So just to start out, have any of you seen the recording that we did applying a social justice framework to midwifery education? Yeah, a couple of you, one of you has at least, maybe another. Yeah, or if you've been to my like ACNM workshop or something. So some of it is from that, but it's also, we're not gonna go into depth. So I provide that link actually, if you haven't yet seen that webinar, so that you can really dig in more deeply. But if you have seen it, you may recognize the image here, which is a dandelion, obviously. And I came to this imagery because of the gardener's tale. So I imagine many of you have probably seen it, but if not, it's I think it's so powerful of a story. I think it's a really good one to share with students as well. And this is Kamara Jones telling that parable of the gardener's tale. And basically what I get from that is that we want our curriculum, we want our learning environments, we want our classroom environments to be much more fertile ground than this for enabling our students to thrive. And I sort of think of this dandelion as Obama, for example. We don't want just Obama to be able to thrive. We want a beautiful environment where many people from all backgrounds have the opportunity to thrive. So that's where my imagery is coming from. Let's see here. There we go. So my name's Kristen Ellen. I am an adjunct faculty at Bastyr, as well as the Midwives College of Utah, and I've taught a health policy course also at Central Washington University in their public health department. I had to show my 2 birth videos because you can't just show them to everybody, so there they are. I have, a strong interest in equity in education and midwifery education, obviously. So I created the website as part of my master's project with many stakeholders providing input. And then I've worked a little bit with MEEK and AIM as well. So, and I also have my BA's in philosophy and women, gender, and sexuality studies. So that's a little tiny bit about me. For our agenda today, we are good. Oh, I have as our first bullet point, review the location of the gender inclusive bathroom, which obviously is a little strange when we're actually a virtual group gathering together, but I put it there as a reminder of how we might consider starting when we're first meeting a new group of people. And that that we set the tone right away. And so that if we are in a brick and mortar space, it's important to remember things like helping people know what is the lay of the land. And one of the things that can be important for our audience, whether we know it or not, is to review the location of the gender inclusive bathroom in our space. So I added that as part of our agenda. I imagine you may have a bathroom in your own house. So there you go. We'll do a quick little overview. I'm going to introduce some checklists, and then we're going to, I'll introduce some potential areas for improvement, and then we're going to do small groups. And that's where you can introduce yourselves again if you need to, especially if our group gets bigger. And then you'll share your ideas and questions with one another regarding the potential areas for improvement that we cover. And then we'll share our small group insights with the larger group, and then we will do our final reflections. And then there's an evaluation for you to fill out if you want to be able to provide feedback on today's call. And then there is not yet a fall webinar scheduled. So if you have any ideas, I really hope you'll give them to me directly or through the evaluation. And I am specifically looking for a contact for White Coats for Black Lives. So if you know anyone, they haven't been answering my emails and there is no phone number. So if you know anyone who's connected with White Coats for Black Lives, I would so appreciate a connection. All right. So our goal today, our learning objective, is to evaluate our syllabi. We want to think about who might feel at home, welcomed, affirmed, included, represented, acknowledged, offended, off-put, or out of place when they read our syllabi. Not that they all read our syllabi, but they should. And it's just one way that we present ourselves and our philosophies to our students, right? Down at the bottom, I reference Wendy Gordon's article. It's a great one for helping you think through racial equity in any space, any project you're doing, even thinking about your syllabi. It can be something helpful, I think. For anyone who feels like, as we go through, that it's just so much information, which it is sort of how I am, that's what the website is designed for, so that you can go back later and plug in where you want to be able to plug in. If you're feeling new to the information, there is a page for you about where to start. And so some ideas for where you might start, where you might go next. More resources here, again, for kind of if you're just getting started and want to kind of get your feet wet, if you haven't accessed these things. And there's so much there that even those of us who aren't new may find really good information there. And you may find things there that you'd like to share with your students if you feel like some of them might be new to specifically racial equity, but also health equity, etc. My website was originally designed mostly focused on racial equity, with a goal to keep adding. I had to narrow it, right, for my master's project, but with a goal to keep trying to make it more and more, not just about racial equity, but considering intersectionality. So I welcome more resources to add if you have additional ones that are missing. Just a reminder about the webinars. Maybe you've seen them all, maybe you haven't, but they are all available as recordings. There is a YouTube site that's linked from the bottom of every page of the website, and you can get that content there to be able to watch it for free. There are multiple, they've been going on for over 2 years now, 4 to 6 a year. So you can access those recordings. Some of them you can get CEUs for through Hive CE. And those links are on the website. There's more than just the 4 that are listed there. There's quite a few more. And then our focus today, curriculum and learning, is one of, oh yes, please. I thought maybe someone had a question. If you do, don't be afraid to ask. And if you don't have a question, maybe you can mute yourself. I see Ruth Ann is asking, do we have data on how many people actually do read our syllabi? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to. Does anyone else know the answer to that? I'm just going to look who might be unmuted but doesn't mean to be. I'm not sure who it is. If you're calling in on your phone, if you could please mute yourself, because I don't think I can mute you unless you want to say something. Thank you so much. And so again, today our focus is curriculum and learning. So there are many resources related to that on this specific page of the website as well. And then specifically today, we're gonna look at curriculum checklists. So there are multiple ones linked from that curriculum page of the website. I definitely recommend checking them out. They're not perfect, which is why I developed an additional one. Not that mine is perfect by any means. It's a draft that I've been thinking about for a while. Is there someone who's maybe not muted, who means to be muted? I can hear you breathing.
It looks like Amy Levi's on the phone. Everybody else looks muted. Oh, she's muted now too.
Okay, thank you so much. Welcome, Amy. I'm so glad you're here. We're just doing a couple little intro, and then we're going to do some small groups. So for curriculum checklists, I highly recommend checking them out. This one in particular is sort of my favorite, and the one that's linked from the bottom, but there's multiple ones. Yeah, these 2 are my favorite, and they're the first 2 links under the curriculum checklist button. And they go into things like considering your course title and description, you know, thinking about accommodations for students, course objectives and outcomes, you know, student expectations. So they do, I think, a good job of offering a short checklist of things for revising your syllabi. But I felt like they weren't complete. So that's why I developed one that was specifically more focused on equity and midwifery education, and that I'm looking for your input on if you're interested in providing feedback. And then there is also a link to some diversity and inclusion syllabus statements, which is something to consider. That's in our list of things we're going to talk about today, and those links are here. So I'm going to provide all of these links to you. And in fact, I already did in a separate email this morning, so that you have them. Just a quick disclaimer, you know, a note regarding my own positionality. I'm a white midwifery educator, and my perspectives are necessarily shaped and limited by that. And so I welcome feedback about how I could do things differently in the future, and know that this checklist that we're going to review today is something that I have done, and so lots more needs to be done in terms. It's very much a draft in terms of having others provide input on what would actually be a good tool for us to use. But we have to start somewhere. So I created a draft for us to work with. And then just, I always have to kind of do a shout out for the Maternal Child Health Systems program where I got my master's, because I learned so much, specifically from many, but Nancy Anderson being the head, and Karen Hayes and Wendy Gordon. So thanks. And then here we are. So this is our new tool for today. I sent you the link only about 2 hours ago in your email, and it is on the website as well. You can print it if you want. For our small groups today, you can access it, you know, on your phone or on a separate web page, whatever's easy for you. But it'll help guide you in terms of some thinking today for our small groups. So this basically is a document that could be used to go through as you're revising your syllabi every term, to think about what can you do to you know, make your learning environment more inclusive, affirming, welcoming, avoid having students feel excluded, etc. So I look forward to hearing from you some feedback about this checklist. And so we'll be going through it on some slides here, but this is sort of the checklist that you can use. And there are some resources linked in the checklist as well. So this is a lot of words, but basically this is sort of the topics that are covered in the checklist, and the sort of topics that we're going to think about today, meaning how can we look at our syllabus, each of our syllabi, and think about these potential areas for improvement, and change hopefully at least one thing every term to improve our syllabi. So I'm gonna, and there's that recording to that webinar that I mentioned down below. And of course there'll be time for questions as well. So this first one is huge. It's huge. But basically, does your course include or take into account at least one of the following? So it doesn't have to be so huge. And there's 3 slides here for this one. But basically, another question you can ask yourself is, can you work to address one of these new concepts in some way in your syllabi every term? And so some of these important concepts that you might want to consider integrating: health equity, social justice, unconscious or implicit bias. We have a webinar on that topic as well. Well, it was a short call on that topic, but there is a presentation at the beginning. Thinking about disparities or inequities, and resilience, Thinking about historical trauma and cultural healing. You might want to think about how to address health literacy, reproductive and birth justice. What about social determinants of health? Does that fit in any of the courses that you teach? Structural competency. And so again, obviously each of these are its own thing. And so part of the webinars are to help us learn more about each of these concepts. And the website as well has resources on each of these. So you might just say, well, that one's interesting to me. I'm going to learn more about that one and try to see if I can fit that into my course in some way. Some other important concepts, structural violence, structural humility, power and privilege, critical consciousness, that life course perspective, so that comes out of public health, weathering theory, why people have a hard time talking about race. Again, implicit bias, I guess I have a repeat, it's important. There, racial anxiety, stereotype threat. We do have a webinar on stereotype threat as well that you can access, or that includes the topic of stereotype threat. Other important concepts that might fit into your courses are the idea of an ally, or and even better, how our students can be an accomplice. The concept of microaggressions, and I put the mosquito video because it's a good one. It's short, and it's a good little introduction for students who might be encountering the concept for the first time. There's also a whole section in the website of more scholarly research and links, resources on microaggressions. Thinking about a framework for quality apologies and helping our students understand how to do that. Remembering that multicultural sources of wealth, which is another way of talking about a strengths-based approach to our teaching and learning. Topics of cultural competency versus cultural humility, so that idea that you can't ever be competent. You've got to keep always doing the lifelong learning and hopefully but keep striving for cultural humility. There it is again, stereotype threat, obviously another important one, but overcoming it, that idea of overcoming stereotype threat, providing wise feedback to our students. The concept of intersectionality might be something that fits into your courses. Considering how you might facilitate a growth mindset, and then thinking about how to facilitate a positive racial climate, and even teaching that to our students. So those are some of the important concepts, just a few, that you might consider. How can I make sure at least one of these shows up in my course? And how can I add at least one of these things in some way every term to just keep revising over time? Some resources, as I mentioned, the website has a section on microaggressions and education. There's a page on internal privilege and resources. And then in the middle there, it's a great resource if you haven't ever intersected with it. But you might share it with your students, you might just engage with it yourself, but a great booklet about responding to everyday bigotry, how to speak up in different settings, whether that's with your family at Thanksgiving dinner, if you celebrate Thanksgiving, or as a teacher in a classroom setting, etc. With your boss, if that's necessary. And then these are each of the other potential areas for improvement. It's fine to interrupt me if you have a question, so don't hesitate. But we are going to go through this pretty quickly because, again, there is that other webinar with more detailed focus. But the topic that we want to definitely try to think about today in our small groups is noticing who in our courses is given expert status. So who writes the materials? Who are the guest speakers? Who wrote the books? Are they all white? Are they all men? Etc. Okay. We want to always be thinking about how can we focus on strength and resilience, not just disparities, not just inequities, though we have to be able to talk about inequities as well. And so I'm at this place of really trying to not talk about one without the other, to not be, if we're going to talk about one during a class, we're going to cover both if we can. That's a goal anyway. I don't know if I always achieve it, but it's a goal. And so again, same topic here, but just thinking about how our focus does matter. Even using the word inequities instead of disparities puts the focus on the inequity of the system, as opposed to it being this thing that people may internalize. Trying to have it be focused on the system problem. And so one big example, right, is when we're talking about GDM risk, right? Do we focus on this genetic problem that people have, or do we also, you know, whether or not there is some physical genetic component, do we always also talk about the way in which Native people in this country were and still are displaced from traditional foods? There's a section on the website about strength-based interventions. I could use a lot more. There's a lot more out there, but there are a few things if you're interested in this concept. And just also trying to think, considering activities, how can we increase the motivation and hope of our students? You may do that through fostering a growth mindset, yeah, but that's what enables, part of what predicts student willingness to succeed and interest in succeeding and ability to succeed, is hope, actually. So how can we foster that? Here are just a few. We want to reconsider the content of our courses, and we want to make sure we're always highlighting diverse resources in one way or another, maybe multiple ways. Here are just a few things to consider possibly adding to your courses. And so again, you'll have these slides, but it might be that you teach lactation and you want to make sure you include the MOCA manual. You might teach Introduction to Cultural Humility and you want to have them read The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. You know, even the Birthing Justice, Black Women, Pregnancy and Childbirth book is a lot of lived experience. So maybe you're teaching a genetics course and you want to include the lived experience of someone who gets that bad news they wished they hadn't gotten. You know, you may even include things like battling over birth, really great qualitative information in there. I strongly recommend engaging with that resource if you haven't already. So there's a lot out there. I started to make another resource list for you today that I can share. It's not finished, but this is just the beginning, right, of highlighting diverse resources in our courses. Some additional midwifery history resources. We want to make sure we don't talk about, right, everything starting with white midwives in the 70s. We all know this, hopefully, right? If not, we're learning it, and that's good. So some resources there might be African-American midwifery in the South, Japanese-American midwives, Muslim midwives, the story of, you know, an Alabama midwife, etc. And maybe you have each student read a different thing and present, you know, or etc. You know how to be teachers, but I'm just presenting some possible resources to consider. And so, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just remembering to acknowledge historical realities that impact experience. Consider including lived experience. That's a way to draw in when you have all white authors who write the books that you use for your course. That's, you know, bringing in that lived experience is a way to add content that helps students feel like they belong. And if you don't want to have, you know, one way to have more resources, right, when you always feel like, well, they already have too much to read and they complain, one way is that you can have them each read different things. Or if your name begins with A through E, read this. If your name begins with F through M, read this. And then they share with their fellow students about what their reflections. And then you can also have recommended reading, although be careful about just putting all of the diverse resources into the recommended reading as opposed to the actual reading for the course. But there really is, there's more than you could assign, right? And so that is one thing you can do. Another thing we want to think about is enabling students to see themselves in the course content so that they can hopefully establish a sense of belonging and connection, because that predicts student retention. And so these examples here, there are resources for all of this, specifically the book Bandwidth Recovery, is a great one. If you didn't get to come to our book club, you could read it twice in a week. I know that because I did in order to prepare for the book club. It's really easy reading, and so much in there. I mean, you could probably read it 5 times and get something different out every time. And there is on the website a link to some excerpts from that as well if you don't want to read the whole book. Another focus area, we want to just think about how can we emphasize community connections in our syllabi. So, you know, you may somehow integrate these organizations and these resources. There was a point when I never even knew any, almost if not any of them existed. So how might you incorporate them, draw them into projects, etc. And there are more and different than are here, but these are examples of something you might consider including. Everything from Sister Song to the National Aboriginal Council of Midwives. Yeah. And again, you have links to all of this in the slides. Another potential area we want to think about is how do we consider the implications for vulnerable, resilient populations or those on the margins? And so somewhere in our course, how do we draw this in? The impact of, you know, that our clients that we may serve, who may be racial ethnic minorities, who may be religious minorities, who may be low income, who may be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, bisexual, queer, intersex, or two-spirit. Have we thought about refugees, incarcerated clients, homeless, hungry clients, differently abled clients? So just trying to think about how do you bring it in to your course. Assessing terminology and language. We do have a recent webinar on thinking about gender inclusion and gender inclusive language. There's actually 2 different ones. Thinking about gender inclusive language. We always trying to do that first person language. So a baby with Down syndrome, not a Down syndrome baby, right? And also thinking about person first language with obesity, diabetes, all of that. Avoiding co-opting language, like even in a meeting, right? Oh, let's have a powwow, that kind of thing we want to avoid. And then we already talked about inequities versus disparities. So these are just a few examples. Reconsidering the content of questions that we pose and the case study examples that we use. So always trying to avoid stereotyping, asking others if they think are we achieving our goal of avoiding stereotyping here? And we want to also consider who is given visibility in our case examples. And then I just included from my health policy course, this is one way that I changed questions to just try to draw in that how are different people and different populations affected. So we want to assess our methods of evaluation. This is huge. Some examples are given here. And resources in the checklist. You know, and there's multiple levels of evaluation, right? We want to let our students evaluate us, hopefully mid-quarter anonymously, and then after the course is over, we want to think about how we evaluate students, what kind of assessments we're using, and you know, you might consider creating a structure that encourages revisions, redos, second tries, frequent specific feedback, and consistent support. You know, in all your spare time, but really it's shown to support student success. And these concepts, again, a lot of them are described in the bandwidth recovery book, standards-based grading, and considering some deadline flexibility. We want to think about how are we allowing for diversity of expression and reactions. Maybe not always just having students write everything. You know, can they provide you with a video recording of themselves? Can they provide you with a voice recording? Maybe having them create a web page instead of not always handouts, etc. Also, you may or may not decide that some resources might be too sensitive and you want to allow students the option to do something else that's relevant to your course and learning objectives, but that isn't exactly what everybody else is doing. Adopting inclusive excellence in assessment. So again, thinking about assessment and, might you consider allowing up to 50% of what a student has to be turned in to be done verbally instead of always having to write. And then our Xavier example that's referenced here is to support the success of a diverse student body, trying to do assessment early and often, but not necessarily with a penalty attached. And then adding study guides. Thinking about mapping student demographics, we're almost done. Basically, if you're aware of who's going to be in your class the next term, really thinking about those students and thinking about how can I help the students that are going to be in my class next term feel included, affirmed, welcomed, not excluded. And so, we only have Canadian students every so often these days, and so I'm like revising my syllabi and then taking it back out again for the specific Canadian learning activities. But also I had, in the last few years, I've had a couple students from Puerto Rico for the first time. So I had to go through and be like, oh, every time I mention state and provinces, I should have been mentioning US territories or Canadian territories. And I wasn't. So thinking about that. And then just, our goals, long-term goals, right? Trying to address all learning styles and enable students to recover lost bandwidth. So we've mentioned that a couple times, but kind of just thinking about different ways that we can do that. Things like small group work, gamification, activities that require movement, employing strategies that enable students to build self-efficacy, audiovisual resources, creating a space for a learning styles assessment for students. Also, we're getting to the end here, but another topic area for potential improvement is reviewing the content of our courses for cultural appropriation. So we want to, just check out what do we have going on. Have we maybe done something that is cultural appropriation? A classic example is smudging, and I'm sure there are many other examples. I just added that one. Thanks to my some of the work we've been doing at MCU as faculty, I was thinking of that one. And then thinking about crafting a syllabus statement, somewhere near the beginning of your syllabus. You might already do a teaching philosophy, so you might add it there if you want, or you can have a separate syllabus statement. There are some examples out there that I think are pretty powerful. Some students will read your syllabus, and one of you is going to tell me how many later. No, that's your quiz. But you never know. You never know who's reading it, and you never know what pages they're reading, so something to consider. How do you want to set the tone? And do you want to demonstrate your values and how you want to try to respect difference and how you want to ask the students to respect difference? Do you want to, provide some information about how they can access campus resources in your syllabi, that kind of thing. And then finally, just that last potential area is committing to lifelong learning. How do we each want to do that? So I like this idea of imagine creating a postcard to your best self, and say what do you want to achieve with regard to expanding your fund of knowledge with regard to social justice and equity and midwifery education in the next month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Because there's so much, right? You've got to just take a little piece and bite off. What do you want to bite off and try to chew in the next little bit and the next long bit and the next long term as well? So your personal strategic planning for yourself and your lifelong learning. And so this is just a very quick list of resources. Again, you're gonna, you have the checklist I was talking about that references the things that we just went through on the slides, the actual slides, a link to those. And then there is a supplemental handout that I haven't updated since the ACNM workshop I did last year, but it's still very relevant. So hopefully you find it useful if you want to access that. All right, so it's time for small groups. I'm gonna go ahead and try to shut this recording off. If I can figure out how to do that. There we go.